Delegates from dozens of developing nations walked out of financing talks at the UN COP15 biodiversity summit being held in Montreal in Canada. They're citing a lack of compromise from wealthy countries to agree a new global nature pact. About 70 countries, mostly from Africa, also from Argentina and Brazil, left the meeting in protest over a perceived lack of progress on funding for nature protection efforts worldwide. Most of the developing governments had earlier joined forces at COP15 to call for a new dedicated biodiversity fund. Well, for a little bit more on this, we're now joined by South African journalist Claire Keeton. Claire, thanks so much indeed for joining us. This is quite a move by developing nations to march out of talks.
I think it was quite a dramatic moment in the negotiations, which have been going very slowly since they started a week ago. So there's been a lot of frustration mounting, especially from the global south. And that was kind of a tipping point for South Africa and those other countries to walk out. You know, they're the countries with the greatest biodiversity. So they're saying that if there is a strong action plan, these will be the countries, South Africa, other African countries, countries in Latin and South America and Asia, who will be responsible for implementing the protections, and that requires money. So one of the things they're calling for is a biodiversity fund, a new fund.
All right. Talk to us a little bit about the challenges that the developed nations have put on the table and why the developing nations are saying that's just not good enough.
So one of the big calls at this conference is 30 by 30. So it's a call to have 30% of the world's land and oceans and inland waters protected by 2030. But developing countries are saying they will need a lot of money and resources to be able to implement this. And they're not seeing the kind of commitment that's needed from the developed world to make it a reality. There's been an estimation that at least $700 billion are needed to get this off the ground, to close the biodiversity funding gap.
And South Africa has been quite clear about its position.
Yeah, South Africa is firmly aligned in this with other countries in the African group. And I think there's kind of unity on this issue that countries who have the biodiversity need help in protecting it. You know, South Africa is the third most biodiverse country in the world.
So I just wonder how much of this was predicted, because if we think of the Egypt COP meeting, financing is the big issue, and it's developed versus developing. I suppose it shouldn't surprise us that this spilled over to the COP15 biodiversity conference.
I think money is always going to be a thorny issue. It's always going to be a source of deadlocks. And, you know, even from the days before the start of this conference, there's been a lot of disagreement. So there were more tensions going into the conference than expected, and it's been a slow process in trying to resolve them. In fact, there's a lot of concern among delegates that it's moving very slowly because they're trying to reach a final agreement by Monday on how to proceed. And financing is one of the big issues, which is obviously not making much progress. But today you have ministers arriving from around the world for what's called the high-level segment of the conference. So there's a hope that having, you know, people with more power and authority will speed up the process.
Apart from funding and financing, how else is it going? Is there progress being made in other areas?
To be honest, it's not going very well overall. Like there's a lot of issues where there just seems to be contention. And disputes are marked by brackets in the text agreement. And instead of the brackets being removed, they seem to be increasing as the week goes on. So there's blocks who align and who agree on things like 30 by 30 or the need for Indigenous people. There's been some progress on that front, the need that Indigenous people and local communities need to play a bigger role, that they are the stewards of biodiversity in general. And I think that might be one area where there is some progress, because a lot of parties agree on that.
Is it still also, even beyond funding and financing, the issues are developed versus developing nations?
Those are the kind of broad lines. But you do have developed nations like Canada have made big commitments to increase funding. Look, there's inconsistencies, and that's what sort of first world countries are being called out on. So they can put a lot of money into funding something like protecting biodiversity, but at the same time, they're still paying billions of dollars into subsidizing harmful industries. So activists are saying, take away some of those subsidies and put them into protecting biodiversity, and it'll benefit everyone, because you need a thriving ecosystem to have a thriving economy.
So what does this walkout mean? I mean, is this a threat of collapsing part of the talks, the whole talks, or might the ministers save the day?
Well, there's definitely a hope that the ministers will save the day. I don't think it means the talks themselves will collapse, because when there was a stock taking over the weekend after the first couple of days, countries from the global south said they are committed to the process. And even back then, they were flagging issues around finance and their concerns with it. So I don't think they'll abandon it, but I think it was a signal that this is a real problem and there needs to be a real commitment and more political will to see results.
But these developing nations have the money. That's not really the issue. Why don't they want to part with it?
Well, I mean, you could get 100 different answers, but behind the scenes, there have been discussions about how much pressure they're under because of the global, because of the conflict in Europe, the rising prices of oil and gas. So even countries that historically have been more generous are raising, issues of having available funds to do what's needed.
All right, so you've been watching this for some days now, and I just wonder, as you get back to your hotel room and quietly reflect, what are your thoughts so far about the globe, the planet, in dealing with this issue of biodiversity? I know that there are a lot of South Africans, when we use that word, they have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think what has come out quite clearly is we need to make biodiversity and the protection of species, which is really what it's about, and the protection of habitats. We need to make that connection to human well-being so that people understand it affects all of our lives, all of our futures. There's a report recently that 55% of the GDP internationally depends on our ecosystems. We live off the earth, and yet we're busy killing it at a faster rate than ever before. I mean, the figure is, 1 million species threatened with extinction unless we take rapid and committed action. And the hope is that this conference will be the start of that. Yeah. But so far, it's moving at a worryingly slow pace, as one of the speakers this morning said.
What do you think we might be able to leave the conference with, just based on what you've seen so far?
I think we will have a global biodiversity framework. I think it will be weaker than a lot of the activists and global South countries were hoping for. I'm not sure that there's going to be a new global biodiversity fund set up to support the cause of the developing world. But I think there will be, it's hard to even say if the 30 by 30 commitment will happen at this stage. But I think the last few days will see a lot more urgency.
All right, let's hope that the ministers come in with authority and political will to do the right thing. Claire, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Thanks very much for the time.
Thank you. All right, that's Claire Keeton, who's a journalist in Canada at the moment for this gathering, biodiversity conference that's taking place. And a number of developing nations walked out of funding talks because they feel the developing nations are just not committed to a new funding program.